This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. This podcast is simple in my mind. Give me clear thinking, and I'm happy. Give me good sushi, and I'm happy. Give me a great bowl of some form of Vietnamese soup, I'm happy. Give me a fantastic steak, I'm happy. A great hamburger, I'm happy. Great pizza, I'm happy. Of course, in moderation, I don't want to go overboard on the size of myself. But my point is clarity, simple, no bullshit. And I love individuals that dive into a topic and put aside the so-called religion, partisan politics of whatever, and dive into it honestly. My guest today, Bradley Campbell, has done that. He is a sociologist at Cal State Los Angeles, the co-author of The Rise of Victimhood Culture, Microaggressions, Safe Spaces, and the New Culture Wars. I don't know how the hell you're going to succeed at anything in life if you're fragile. If you're a fragile, you know what? It's over, man. Just sit in your parents' basement in your tighty-whities and just wait for the end. So when an author like Bradley dives into a topic like this, the rise of victimhood culture, it's a reminder to all of us to be simple, to be basic, to be truthful, and to put the nonsense to the side. Put the nonsense to the side, and you can have a great life. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Bradley Campbell. You know, as an outsider looking in, 25 years removed from college campuses, I went to George Mason in Northern Virginia, went to Florida State for grad school, so I have a decent memory of what campuses can look like, and something closer to the DC area, something in the South. You know, I don't recall any conversation, any experience that would have remotely put me in a position to be sharing with other people, talking, that I was a victim. And look, I'm a white guy, so somebody could immediately say, well, of course you're not a victim. You have privilege. Okay, that's a whole different discussion. Maybe we'll get into some of that. But I don't remember any of this kind of conversation like this. I just remember kind of going to college and, you know, you learn things and you party and stuff like that. And now I look at this, to me, it's like I'm on Earth and college campuses are on Mars. I'm not necessarily saying Earth is better or Mars is worse, but I'm just saying it looks like that the shift that's taking place from an outsider looking in, and we're going to dive into all this, is really dramatic in less than a few decades.
Right. And I think that's a lot of people don't realize, like they remember, oh yeah, I was in college, you know, somebody might say, you know, 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, or certainly 20 or 25 years ago. And you remember that there were campus activists and people with all kinds of radical ideas and stuff. And so a lot of people may think that that's all we're talking about, right? And there really has been this shift that's really in the past 5 years or so. It's different from even when I was in graduate school and I finished at UVA in 2008. It's something new. I had never heard of a microaggression. The term was around before. It also, a lot of people who do hear about it do have that kind of experience as if they're seeing something, some kind of foreign morality, like something on Mars or something, which is one of the reasons it was interesting to us. We have our own, you know, moral ideas about it. We've certainly been critical of the attacks on free speech, but mainly we didn't approach this because we were morally outraged by it. Although, you know, later on as things developed, sometimes some of it was more outrageous, but it was mainly that experience of seeing something that was very different. And this is what draws us to the study of morality, because you see such different patterns in different cultures, different groups. That's what we've always been interested in intellectually. And then to see it happening here, like to look at, you know, at things so near us, like at college campuses, and see people making certain kinds of moral claims that made no sense from the standpoint of certain kinds of morality. People have been taught to have thick skin, ignore insults, ignore slights. And here people were kind of magnifying minor slights. And so people are taught to be charitable toward people, to interpret things generously. And here people were giving like the worst possible interpretation on these things. And it made no sense from a certain moral standpoint. And so we were trying to understand, what the logic was behind it and then why it was occurring.
As I think about microaggressions, and you mentioned Oberlin, was that ground zero? Was that the place that you could see that it started to expand? I would really love to know what you can tell us about the initial start. Was it a handful of people that thought, oh my gosh, we can use this phrase microaggression to capture all of these kind of innocuous statements and reposition them as bad or racist or whatnot? What was the genesis that got this whole ball rolling? Because I'm assuming there kind of was a ground zero and it spread out quickly to other campuses, enterprising students on other campuses, just like Facebook spread. They said, hey, we want some of this microaggression cake too.
Right. When we heard of the idea of a microaggression, it was, as I was saying, Oberlin microaggression site we first heard of. But at the time, there were already several websites like that where college students would publicize their microaggressions. But I don't know exactly if Oberlin, but it was elite campuses like that, and it was the activists among them. It was also Tumblr. One thing I've realized more recently since reading a book by Angela Nagel called "Kill All Normies," which is about both the rise of the alt-right and this kind of what we've called victimhood culture. So on the alt-right, it was coming from 4chan and these kinds of places online. The left-wing activists on Tumblr, especially, like a lot of these concepts were being propagated. Of course, they all come from the universities. And the term microaggression dates back to the 70s. Originally, they were just talking about racial microaggressions. It wasn't a term that got picked up by people, but it was something that they saw in among kind of radical activists and radical ideologies on campus. It has spread fast. One of the reasons it's been able to spread, I think, is by modern technology. So people were able to kind of online and chat rooms and Tumblr, all these places, to start using these concepts. So microaggressions, trigger warnings, and why it resonated with some people, I think it just had to do with the social environment. So you have these environments where it's almost paradoxical, but it's not really if you understand how morality works, because it's in these environments where people are really most concerned about racism and bigotry and stopping it, in these environments that are fairly diverse and egalitarian, like a modern college campus, Oberlin. These aren't traditional societies, or it's not the Jim Crow South or these other kinds of places. But it's in those environments where people are especially concerned with racial oppression, slights, insults, where it's not happening as much, where they then turn to the more minor events. I mean, you could think of, it would also be the case that in a society where people tended to all agree on religious ideas, it might be minor deviations from those religious ideas that would be considered heresies and very horrible offenses. So it's kind of common that it works that way, that in this case, where there's more equality, anything perceived as an offense against equality, like putting someone down, insulting someone, slighting their culture in an environment that values diversity, anything that appears to slight someone's culture, to not value diversity, seems especially bad. So that's why it took root, I think, in these environments where activists were pushing against racism and these kinds of things, where people began to see what they saw as minor acts of racism as especially bad and harmful. The idea is that all these microaggressions actually harm people. It's not that they wouldn't see it as just that they're extra sensitive, but that they're coming to recognize how an accumulation of microaggressions and small offenses ends up oppressing people.
Before we start to jump into some examples so people can better understand what's really going on college campuses, I have a really big picture take from my perspective. I would love for you to address it. It seems like to me, as a guy looking on from afar, that the individual is no longer so important on college campuses. And what I see from a distance is the collective. I see the group almost, and I'm going to use the racial term, it almost seems like in many cases, I can look at some of the events that I've seen on Berkeley campuses when right-wing speakers came to speak. It does look like lynch mobs. It looks like out-of-control mobs. What I'm really curious about, though, is that this collective, if you're going to believe in the collective, there's always a ruler, there's always an authority, right? So what I'm really surprised about what's going on the campuses is the trust that the students place in whoever the leader is. They don't seem to want a say, really. They want a rule passed, they want a regulation, they want it enforced, and they just seem to have this trust of the system, of the people in power, which is really odd. I think many generations in America would say, hold on, don't just trust the leaders. Let's be skeptical. Whereas this group seems to just be like, oh no, whatever. We'll just trust the leaders. Am I seeing this wrong from an outside perspective?
This is part of it. And when we started trying to understand what these conflicts were about and how to analyze them, we're thinking in sociological terms and cross-culturally, like, what are the different ways people handle conflicts? And of course, you could be offended by a minor slight and want to handle it yourself through violence or action or something. And this is what people do in what we call honor cultures, like where men fought duels with one another or used other kinds of violence in response to even minor slights, right? They were hypersensitive to insult too, slurs against their character or something. But in this case, you saw people appealing to authorities, right? So it's a hypersensitivity to insult combined with an appeal to authority. So they weren't simply, what they were asking was for other people, appeal to third parties more generally. They were asking other people to recognize what was happening, but they're also asking college administrators to do something about it, to start, having training about microaggressions or prohibiting them or prohibiting speakers from coming in who would offend them, who would violate their safe spaces and things like that.
Define a safe space. There might be people out there that are not really grasping what a safe space is.
There have been a lot of new kinds of terminology introduced, and we see this as part of this new morality that we're looking at that we call victimhood culture. A safe space can simply mean creating an environment for minorities and others to get together to discuss things. So originally it had to do with feminism, and the idea was just to have a place to talk about women's issues. Even then, the idea of a safe space kind of implies that you're not safe elsewhere. But it's come to refer to the demands of activists, really, that the entire campus be a safe space. I mean, sometimes they'll create particular things they call safe spaces. At Brown University, Wendy McElroy, who was a woman who was coming in to criticize some feminist ideas, she came to campus. Many of the students were outraged. They saw her as propagating rape culture and this kind of thing. And they created a safe space where people could go during the talk, and there would be coloring books and that they, so they could, and bubbles and Play-Doh and things like that to kind of calm themselves. The idea was that they would be so distraught from hearing, or even not even from hearing the speaker because they weren't going to the talk, but from knowing that this person would be on their campus expressing these ideas, that they would need to retreat to a safe space, somewhere they could feel safe and comfortable. And then the idea is, beyond that, the entire campus should be a safe space. So this is why they demand that speakers not be allowed to come in. People like Charles Murray or Ben Shapiro or these other people who have led to riots and outrage from activists. The idea is that you're violating a safe space. You're really imperiling their safety. They often, in terms of the moral language that's used here, they've come to talk about ideas they find offensive, ideas that they consider as furthering oppression, and they say that it's the equivalent to violence. They might say it's literally violence. And so if it's violence, or if it's the same as violence, then of course you must suppress it. So they're blurring the distinction between speech and violence. And that's why they demand then that the university administration stop it, just as they wouldn't allow acts of violence. They shouldn't allow these speakers to come in and say offensive things. And then the idea is if the administrators won't stop it, then they have the right to go shut it down themselves. There is this reliance on authority, and it does seem weird, I think, from the standpoint of those of us who are more favorable to free speech and more absolutist on it, is that it's not the only reason for free speech, but one of the reasons is that free speech is a kind of mutual disarmament where I agree to let you say what you want to say because I know that people who agree with me might not be empowered come the next election or the next. The idea is that that having free speech and having this guarantee of it protects my rights too. I don't expect always to be the one wielding power. It is strange then, I think, for many of us to see how much they rely on it. On the one hand, they see society as racist and white supremacist and all these things, and on the other hand, they somehow trust university officials and others to they want to break down that norm against free speech and trust them to censor speech. I mean, why do they think that they won't be the ones who are censored? It is kind of strange, I think.
When I first saw some of the, I guess it was the Milo events at Berkeley, and watching some of the news on that, of course, you watch that and you say to yourself, okay, why do the Berkeley administrators not send out law enforcement? Why are they allowing their students to blow up their campus? That's a particular issue. It's not kind of just raise your hand and say, excuse me, what's going on here? I start to think, okay, this is a right-left thing. And then I start to go through your work, and just in my own followings, I see the work of people like Bret Weinstein and Sam Harris and Glenn Greenwald, guys that are not considered conservative or right-wing. And they're starting to say the same things and think the same things that I'm thinking. And you make the case here too. They say, and this is where I'm really going here, is it's not really the typical clash between, let's say, liberal and progressive and conservative or secular and religious. This is a whole other new moral culture to wrap our arms around. Again, like I said, I mean, Sam Harris does not describe himself as a conservative, nor does Bret Weinstein, nor does Glenn Greenwald. But they are saying things where I listen to them and I'm like, well, that's exactly what I believe. And they are surely not on the side of the safe spaces and the victimhood culture as well.
Well, a lot of what we're talking about, at least the extent of it, is something very new. It's not a clash between liberals and conservatives because liberals and conservatives have traditionally all held ideas that clash with this.
As you just said, free speech.
And free speech, if anything, has been associated with liberals as the ones defending it most robustly. And so the liberals who are now defending free speech, they aren't the ones who are being inconsistent. It does, I think, since conservatives are the ones mainly being censored on campuses, you see people are sort of naturally tribal and partisan, and you see less support from a lot of liberals who would have formerly been in favor of free speech for it. But the consistent liberal position has been for free speech, and also this other kinds of things, these concepts like microaggressions. I mean, the very idea that speech can be violence, right? That ordinary political disagreements, that there's not this distinction between violence and speech, where speech is allowed even if it's offensive and violence is prohibited by the state, right? That's kind of the ordinary distinction that we all understand. And that's something that's being blurred by the campus activists. They are left wing, but those ideas are not ideas that have normally been associated with the left, or certainly with liberals, political liberals in the United States. And so you get people, some of the biggest critics of what we call victimhood culture on campuses have been people who are liberals or moderates, certainly like people who voted for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. I mean, you mentioned Bret Weinstein and Sam Harris. They fought, and Glenn Greenwald have been normally on the left. Other people, John McWhorter of Columbia University, a linguist at Columbia University, Jonathan Haidt, a psychologist at New York University. These people are all liberals or moderates and extreme critics of this, and they understand, the people within the universities understand how much some of these new values threaten the norms of the university. If you turn the university into a safe space, a place where certain groups of people should never be offended, you completely undermine scholarship. If the university is a place where you pursue truth and where you can have robust debate, there'll always be people who are offended. So if anything, the university should be a place where offensiveness is even more tolerated than in the outside world, than in corporations and places like that. And the idea that it should be a place where there's even more sensitivity and more restrictions on free speech sort of undermines any possibility of good scholarship. I mean, right now, it's not the dominant thing happening on campus. It's not the dominant morality, but it's spreading and people aren't resisting it. And so it certainly threatens to completely undermine what universities are supposed to do.
Let's talk about professors for a moment, because we are mentioning some names, quote, on the left are against these types of things. But I have to assume that there are a good many professors, for whatever motivation, that are pushing these ideals, pushing these narratives, and helping to support. I watched something, it was a couple years ago, up in a housing situation at Yale where a professor tried to defend some stance that he was taking, and the students were just screaming at him out in this courtyard. And I thought, my gosh, this is so crazy. This professor seems very normal. But there must be quite a few that are supporting this. And I remember also something in the news a few years back, there was some type of protest. I want to say this was in the St. Louis area, and there was a female professor, and she was caught on tape, screaming about bringing muscle in to help push the reporters and journalists away. And so there was a clear example of a professor that was right in line with these views. Speak to what's going on with professors, though, and how divided this might be on campus, because you mentioned a few right there that are against this. But is there an overwhelming support among professors for this?
There's not an overwhelming support for it. A lot of people simply aren't involved in it, and particularly people in the natural sciences who sort of think that, the idea is they'll just go about their work. A lot of them don't yet feel threatened by it. Most people probably wouldn't support some of the extreme manifestations of it. What happens is that there are people who are totally in favor of it. As you're saying, the woman you're talking about at the University of Missouri was Melissa Click. And so she was on camera, telling people to bring in muscle and actually joining in the protests, trying to prevent a reporter from filming, I think. A lot of professors see themselves as activists. The idea is if there's a protest going on campus, they should be the ones who are part of it, and they should be out in the forefront, maybe even leading it. So some of them are just hardcore leftist activists, really ideologues, people who see it as their job to pursue left-wing politics, to teach that to students. You see it in some disciplines more than others. So we have a chapter in our book called Sociology, Social Justice, and Victimhood, where we talk about our own field, sociology, where many of the professors see themselves as what they would call activist scholars. And activism for them means left-wing activism. They adopt what they call sociological theories that are mainly moral stances about, they are to some extent analyses of society. So they're what we call conflict theories, where the idea is that there's some group oppressing other groups, right? And so the groups vary, and it can be men oppressing women, or straights oppressing gays, or whites oppressing blacks, or all of those. But the idea is that every interaction, every institution is analyzed in this way as oppression. And so that's why you see even like mundane conversations being analyzed as microaggressions or something. Everything's furthering oppression. That kind of work is sort of the intellectual background for what we're calling victimhood culture. It provides the intellectual support. This is where the ideas come from. And then you have a lot of professors who, as I said, are see themselves mainly as activists. That's not most sociologists even, but what happens is that most sociologists do see themselves as on the left, right? So they would consider themselves liberal or on the left. And not only are they almost all liberal or on the left, but they see that kind of as their mission, right? There's a sociologist, Christian Smith, wrote a book called The Sacred Project of American Sociology. He was critical of this, but the idea was that sociologists see themselves as having a sacred project. So all of them are trying to fight against oppression, and so even those who are more scientific, who are doing survey research, running analyses of society, doing more serious work, they still, like in the questions they ask, and sometimes in the answers that they'll restrict themselves to, they see themselves as furthering left-wing ideas. So even if they're not as extreme as some of those other people, they tend to tolerate them more. And so that's the tendency to think that maybe they're misguided, maybe they're too extreme, but they're, kind of the good people, and maybe the people that they're clashing with are the bad people. That's certainly not everyone. And, another professor you mentioned, Nicholas Christakis, is the person at Yale who was surrounded by students because he was one of the headmasters, along with his wife. They were called masters of Silliman College, which is a residential college where students live, and they'll have faculty there who are there to kind of live there too and guide them and support them. So Nicholas Christakis is a sociologist at Yale. His wife Erica was there also as headmaster and working and teaching there. And she'd written just a defense of the idea that students should be able to choose their own Halloween costumes. A notice had gone out by a dean or someone, warning students about offensive Halloween costumes around Halloween time. And she just said, well, she wrote a letter saying something like, is this how do we really need the university to police this? Or couldn't students police themselves? Couldn't they talk to other people if they're offensive, things like that? And the students went nuts. They saw this as offensive, as violence toward them and all that kind of stuff, and demanded their ouster. They surrounded Nicholas Christakis for, what his wife said, and screamed at him, cursing at him.
By the way, the video is insane. It's emotional train wrecks that you can't ever imagine had the SAT scores to get into Yale.
It's unbelievable. And I think like when that happened, this was something that was really interesting too, because when we come across the idea of microaggressions in 2013, and my co-author and I wrote an article called Microaggression and Moral Cultures. And this is where we said that there was a victimhood culture arising, and we described the context and what expected it to spread. And then fall of 2015, so our article came out late 2014, then fall of 2015, these campuses started exploding, like with what we consider, victimhood culture. It's kind of like, they're like victimhood eruptions with the people surrounding Nicholas Christakis at Yale and the events at University of Missouri. It seemed like madness to a lot of people at the time. I obviously see a lot of that behavior as problematic, as undesirable. But I think more than that, we wanted to just try to understand it too. There wasn't a lot of analysis of it, and I think people are still grasping to understand why it's happening. We thought, we think we can do that a little bit.
To me, as an outsider looking in, this just looks like, at its root level, and you've got a lot more familiarity with the territory and a lot more research and study than myself, but it really at a base level, and I see this sometimes, I think when people really want to complain about Trump, I don't think it's necessarily like, oh, okay, Trump has had some bad behavior with women. Well, okay, a lot of guys on the left, bad behavior with women. Okay, a lot of bad behavior all around. But to me, some of this ground level stuff at the college campuses seems to be an envious, jealous position of others and a feeling of, I can't get there myself. So I will then use the state, use the university system to try and equalize. But I think a lot of it starts with this individual lack of belief in oneself, because it used to be that if one felt slighted, you would work around it. You would move past it. I mean, I've had a very famous Black economist on this show named Walter Williams, and he's all about the bootstraps. Let's go. Let's walk around these problems. Let's don't sit here and fight them all day where it's an opportunity cost. We're losing time fighting idiocy. Let's just move around. That's not the case right now. And I mean, am I completely crazy to think that some of the motivation, even though it's hidden behind these great terms like safe spaces and microaggressions, is kind of a fanciful way to hide a jealousy and envy?
That makes sense. The way I would look at it is that we all feel slighted at some point. The way I would look at it more is that people are being taught, and somebody's coming up with the ideas, but when you think of students, they're going into classes, they're learning these things, and they're being trained, and maybe before they come to college too, they're being trained not to ignore slights. I mean, this is a problem we all struggle with, right? We feel slighted, and we realize at some point, or we're taught to remember to ignore it, right? And that we'll be more successful if we don't go around, perceiving ourselves as being slighted, holding grudges all the time, interpreting things in the worst possible way. And I would just see it as it's pretty easy to get people to feel slighted and to tell them people are constantly insulting you. You just have to interpret their words in a particular way. And I think it is seductive in a way, because it gives you a way of feeling morally superior and it can be seductive, feeling like somebody who's been victimized and who's pressed and who deserves help.
Feel free to disagree with me. I'm not. I'm just kind of giving you my outsider's perspective.
Because I've also thought it's interesting, though, that the students who are most involved in this, it's not as if these are failures in life. So it's not as if the woman at Yale screaming at Nicholas Christakis, "Who the f hired you?" and this kind of stuff. It's not as if she's failed out at life, and now that she's taking it out on Christakis, she's a student at Yale. She's going to be incredibly successful. This is part of what we saw as kind of strange, and something we're trying to understand is that the people who are claiming victimhood in these environments, these are not people who are poor and downtrodden and in all these ways. It was more like the rising elites in society. At least with some of them, I mean, anybody can feel envy, right? Like, they're still younger, and Christakis is a professor at Yale, who has kind of some higher status than them. But there are, again, these are people who are incredibly successful. I mean, to be a college student in the United States, first of all, is putting you in a good position worldwide. But to be a student at Yale puts you in the elite.
Okay, let's get this down to brass tacks, because this all has to go somewhere. If we have this kind of thinking at the activist level across the American university system, well, they're not going to be in that system forever. They're going to leave. I'm sure, like sun rising, sun setting, many of them will go into government. Many will go into politics. There's power there, and there's the ability to make law. And so I look at one of the terms right now, white privilege. I see this, that, supposedly me, Mike Covel, the fact that I was born white means that I have a special benefit, a special something. Now, as all these students move out into the real world and assume leadership positions, isn't the natural progression, at least from my perspective, isn't the natural progression new laws, new regulations? And I have to wonder, isn't the natural evolution of this, if I just play this out, they say, someone says, hey, this guy Mike Covel, he's white, he's got a privilege. Okay, we've got victimhood culture, we've got social justice, it bleeds into policy. So what's the end goal? Is the end goal ultimately that when a new baby comes out of the new mother and we then observe the skin color, that the law will dictate something different based on that color? I mean, that's where you have to naturally take all this stuff, don't you? Because if you don't take it there, then what's the point of this whole thing?
Yes, and this is part of why we think this is important. So if somebody says, well, who cares what some activist college students are doing, or are you serious? You're saying this is a new kind of moral shift just because of what some college students are doing? This is the kind of take we get sometimes, right? Oh, there's not a new moral culture arising. But again, like as I was just saying, talking about the students at Yale, these people are the elites of society. These ideas aren't going to stay at college campuses. They've already begun to spread. Corporations have already begun adopting microaggression training and these kinds of things.
Starbucks.
Yes. A lot of the protections that you might assume that you have, like free speech protections, the court rulings right now are very favorable to free speech. If cases go to court, the free speech side wins. I mean, there are very narrow limitations on, very narrow exceptions to free speech, limitations on what the government can do. That's not a problem right now, except that there's no reason to think that the jurisprudence will stay that way, right? If the students that we're talking about who have these ideas, who believe speech, at least speech that they deem as oppressive, is violence and should be suppressed and censored, if they become judges, then they'll rule differently, right?
We see this across Europe.
Right, and the idea already in Europe, I mean, Europe has never had the free speech protections that the United States has, and Canada. And so that it's happening there. And what you're talking about with white privilege, one of the things that interests us too is that in what we're calling victimhood culture, victimhood becomes a kind of status. So it's a kind of moral status. And so if you think about like in an honor culture where honor is a kind of moral status, the opposite of it is cowardice. So people who are thought of as cowardly, men who are unwilling to fight, lose their honor and they're denigrated. But in a victimhood culture where status comes from victimhood, the opposite of victimhood is privilege, right? And so to be privileged puts you in a lower position. You're supposed to acknowledge it constantly and try to work against it and those kinds of things. But it does put you, it places you in a different kind of status. It's a new kind of status system. So you're right. Like if you begin, there's no reason to think that eventually this kind of morality won't become dominant, or at least dominant in more spheres than it is right now. It's not even dominant on college campuses yet, but it's causing a lot of havoc there.
One way we can think about the migration into policy would be the setting aside of law enforcement. One, and I want you to kind of go into this, but violence is a huge part of the victimhood culture, that if you feel this aggrieved stance, you can respond in violence. There was a case out in, I think it was in the Berkeley area as well. Somebody, a protester, I think on the right, was saying something, and somebody in the black mask walked up with a bike lock and smashed this guy over the head. And you couldn't tell who he was, but through the power of the internet and prior videos, et cetera, basically a bunch of internet sleuths figured out who he was. He eventually got charged. It turned out he was like a philosophy professor or something, whatnot, in the San Francisco Bay Area at one of the universities, one of the colleges. And they did arrest him and they did charge him. I don't know where the case stands. But let's be honest about this. We can look at some of these situations that have occurred, these mass riots in America over victimhood issues and social justice issues in the last 5 to 10 years. And the vast majority of people are not arrested. They're not prosecuted. If I would have done this stuff when I was their age, I'd still be in jail. So we already are seeing a change in the law by not enforcing the law.
And especially when you're talking about the speakers on campus who get shut down, and it's not the university decides they can't speak, it's that the university doesn't step in and prevent people from coming in, pulling the fire alarms, shouting them down, and all this stuff, or even actually attacking them, like in the cases you're mentioning, or in the Charles Murray case and others. So actually using violence.
The university doesn't do that for one reason. The university does not stop it because they don't want Kent State Part 2. They don't want to have military combating students. And so now we've reached the complete opposite of Kent State. I mean, obviously Kent State was terrible, but we've reached the complete opposite where students are just allowed to do whatever they want to do because the university administrators don't want to have their police department batoning students, even though the students might be wearing black masks and burning down a building. They don't care. It's crazy.
Yes, and that gets into the idea too, is like, why are the administrators doing this? Why are they taking their sides and this kind of stuff? Sometimes I think it's what you're talking about. They simply have judged that the situation will get out of hand if they intervene, and they're hoping it won't. To some extent, it's because they sympathize with them. When speakers like Milo Yiannopoulos are coming in, the speakers that they themselves wish weren't there, and they sympathize with the students who are outraged.
Milo 25 years ago would have been in some room talking to maybe 50 people, maybe 100 people. The sheer act that Milo's thoughts, his words, can cause people to go nuts, then perform violence, and then they are supported by the university administrators. What's more nuts? It's clearly not Milo that's the nuts part.
It'll be interesting to see how universities deal with it. Some people who are critics of anti-free speech movements and the victimhood culture, people like Jonathan Haidt, who have kind of expressed optimism that it's going to turn around now. Administrators are realizing what's happening, and this will be the kind of turning point. I'm much less pessimistic. I don't see. I see some universities have been kind of forced into protecting free speech, but I don't see this stopping simply because those who believe in this stuff are true believers. I mean, these students, for the most part, the activist students, aren't doing this just for show or theater or something. That's kind of another idea. They really believe it. They believe that there's widespread oppression, and that what they're doing is trying to stop it. If you understand that from their position, they think they're in the right. This is the kind of morality that they have now. It becomes much more difficult to imagine how it stops instead of spreading, especially if people don't, if there aren't enough people within the university to stand against it.
Let me ask one last question, the political question, the one that is the all-encompassing question that we see on cable TV shows every night, whether that's on the left or the right. And we have a president who seems to make roughly half the country go crazy and roughly half the country be supportive. Now, that's not necessarily all too different than any typical shift in presidency, whether you have a Democratic president or a Republican president. America's pretty typical on that. But Trump has really raised the bar. I'm curious what the demographics look like on college campuses today. What is the age of Trump doing to the typical college student? Are the splits on college campuses like the population as a whole, or are there a much bigger majority of students today that are really up in arms about the age of Trump?
I think the polling and stuff shows that students are overwhelmingly against Trump, that this is something that's caused a huge rift between generations in terms of, and especially on, I mean, I'm at Cal State Los Angeles, it's pretty much uniformly anti-Trump. It might be different in West Virginia or certain other kinds of states. All this predates Trump, so Trump isn't the cause of any of it. To some extent, I think it's a fact. I mean, during the campaign, it seemed that there are other things going on too, but the fact that people would look at campuses and see people who were really trying to censor their ideas, or in corporations or other things, like if you look and you find out if somebody's a conservative and they see that people on college campuses think conservatives shouldn't even be allowed to speak, or you look at corporations and people who are expressing ideas that would have been considered pretty normal or dominant or mainstream 10 years ago would be fired for that. And I think it made a lot of people kind of immune to a lot of the criticism of Trump. People would point to something offensive Trump said, and it simply wouldn't matter. It was already baked in, and obviously that repels a lot of people too, and was sort of. But it was part of his appeal to a lot of people. But I also, one of the things we worry about too isn't just the campus activists, but the reaction to them. So and I'm not thinking necessarily just of Trump here, but just the idea. I mean, for one thing, there's a version of conservative victimhood too that kind of reacts to the claims of victimhood by campus activists and by the left, of saying like, well, we're the real victims. Sometimes they are, but it's the idea of kind of this embrace of victimhood and kind of getting status from it that can be a problem in psychology.
No doubt, I definitely see that for sure.
And psychologists talk about competitive victimhood, which are situations where people get into moral arguments where it becomes an argument over who's the biggest victim, and that's a problem. Also, if people on the right, it kind of in reaction to victimhood culture, end up embracing offensiveness. I mean, the culture that we've called dignity culture.
You mean Roseanne?
Well, yeah, I mean, the culture that we've called dignity culture, past that, it's not our term, but others, but, the idea was that part of the idea of dignity culture is that you don't take offense easily. You have thick skin. You give people the benefit of the doubt. You brush off insults. If people do violence against you, you go to the law. And so that's all important. And that's a lot of what the campus activists are rejecting. But also the idea was that you don't cause deliberate offense. I mean, you don't try to offend people. And, sometimes it just happens or it's necessary, especially when you're, like I said, on a campus, you do research and bring new ideas without offense. But the deliberate offense isn't a part of the older culture too. So I think like also people on the right may embrace that as a kind of reaction to it, or even worse kind of ideologies like embracing.
Don't we have to stay though, ultimately at free speech? And unless it's truly fighting words, I mean, if we're going to stay in the spirit of America, then, unless it's the fighting words, shouting fire in a crowded theater, it's just going to be interesting because clearly there's different choices being made right now, different moralities being developed. Let me ask one final little question to you. You are out there on college campuses teaching. You've written this book. What is the reaction to you?
As I said, victimhood culture, the culture of the campus activist isn't really dominant, even in our field of sociology. It's very strong, right? And when people activists often get their way when there's an incident. But it is true that there are people all over on college campuses and stuff expressing all kinds of ideas. This is what's so unusual about some of these incidents is that they are kind of random. It's not as if every time somebody criticizes victimhood culture or favors free speech or expresses a conservative idea. It's not like they get chased from campus or surrounded by students cursing at them like Nicholas Christakis, or And that's what's kind of odd about it. On the one hand, yeah, this is why it should be concern people, because it could happen to anybody who expresses some idea people take offense to. But it's not like it always happens. And it's one reason people need, I think people need to not. People need to stop kind of, giving in to the more extreme elements on campus and actually stand up and favor free speech and robust debate, even for people who disagree with us. I'm mainly trying to analyze the new culture as a sociologist, but I think I don't think we can have healthy universities without free speech. So I'm also happy to advocate that and hope it doesn't cause too much trouble.
The book, The Rise of the Victimhood Culture, Microaggressions, Safe Spaces, and the New Culture Wars. There is definitely a culture war going on in America. I flip a coin, imagine to the future. I cannot have any clue how it's going to shake out. I don't think anyone can foreshadow it, forecast it, predict it. But I do agree with you that this is a really odd foundation that's developing. And to assume that this is just youthful angst on college campuses, this is quite different than what you and I grew up with.
I agree. It's something that surprised even me, even since I've written, since I started writing about it, the speed and some of the extremism on campus. It's moving very fast.
Bradley, I appreciate the time today. Is there a best place we can send people? Obviously, Amazon for the book. Is there a best website we can send people to?
Amazon for the book. We have a blog at victimhoodculture.com, www.victimhoodculture.com, called The Victimhood Report, where we talk about the book and issues that arise and sometimes post things in there, so they can go there too. The Victimhood Report, www.victimhoodculture.com.
I only have one prediction, that I think if your book becomes too popular, you are going to need a safe space. Hey, take care. Thank you for participating today.
Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.